They found him draped in the skins of goats, his speech a faded, guttural rasp. The official logs call him a hero, but the archaeology of his camp suggests a man living in a state of clinical paranoia. Why did the governor of Tierra fear his own salvation? You stand on the edge of a jagged volcanic shoreline where the Pacific wind tastes of brine and old iron. The air here doesn't move. It pushes against you with a heavy, salt-drenched humidity that feels like a weight. Beneath your boots, the remains of 2 pimento wood huts are little more than gray, deteriorating skeletons reclaimed by the jungle. You can still smell the faint bitter scent of charred wood and ancient soot from a signal fire that burned for 1,580 days. It is a sight of absolute crushing silence. This is where the world forgot Alexander Selkirk, a man who survived the hollow hunger only to lose the sound of his own human voice. In May 1703, the mission promised a viscous flow of Spanish gold and eternal glory for the crew of the 90-ton galley, the Cinque Ports. Captain Thomas Stradling stood on the deck, fueled by a reckless adolescent hubris that ignored the decaying state of his own vessel. While the crew dreamed of wealth, the real metrics of their doom were already calculated in the dark. The ship was a technical disaster, its hull riddled with holes from the Torredo Navali's shipworm, turning solid oak into a brittle, honeycombed mess. They were 400 miles from the nearest civilization. It was a blunder of structural integrity that Selkirk, the master navigator, saw with terrifying forensic clarity. The conflict reached its breaking point in September 1704 at the Juan Fernandez archipelago. Selkirk looked at the deteriorating planks and the green viscous flow of seawater entering the hold, and he made a desperate tactical choice. He demanded to be left on the island, betting his life on the solid earth rather than a sinking coffin. Stradling accepted the challenge with a chilling, cold-blooded indifference, watching from the stern as the boat pulled away. Selkirk stood on the sand with a pound of powder, a knife, and a small chest, suddenly realizing he was trapped. He had won the argument, but the price was a total abyssal isolation from the human race. The official maritime logs record his rescue years later, but they failed to explain the forensic anomalies found at his camp. If Selkirk was alone, why were there 2 separate sleeping quarters built with such defensive, paranoid precision? The archives suggest he domesticated the feral cats to protect his rations from a plague of rats, but his journal hints at something else moving in the trees. We know the temperature averaged 64 degrees, and we know he survived on the cabbage trees of the interior, but one question remains. Why, when a Spanish ship finally anchored in the bay, did Selkirk choose to hide in the brush rather than seek his long-awaited salvation? What did he see from the cliffs that was more terrifying than 4 years of silence? The Atlantic swells in 1703 didn't offer a homecoming. They offered a trap lined with salt and arrogance. Alexander Selkirk stood on the deck of the Cinque Ports, watching the Irish coast dissolve into a gray smear of mist. He was the sailing master, a man who lived by the logic of the stars and the strength of oak. But even then, he knew the math was wrong. The mission was privateering, a polite word for state-sanctioned theft. They were chasing Spanish gold, but they were sailing on a countdown. Visual. A wide shot of the 90-ton galley struggling against a wall of dark, churning water. Captain Thomas Stradling was 21 years old and possessed the kind of ego that gets men buried in unmarked deeps. He viewed the expedition as his personal ascension, ignoring the deteriorating state of the ship's lower hull. Selkirk watched the young commander and saw a ghost in the making. The ambition was intoxicating, a dopamine hit that blinded the crew to the reality of their situation. They were kings of the horizon, for now. They left the safety of the harbor and stepped into a void where the law of the land was a memory. Visual. A close-up of Stradling's polished brass buttons reflecting a stormy orange sunset. The Cinque Ports was a masterpiece of hidden decay, a technical debt that was accruing interest with every league. Beneath the waterline, The Teredo navalis worms were hollowing out the structure, turning the hull into a fragile honeycomb. Selkirk heard the wood groaning at night, a sound like a slow rhythmic bone snap. It wasn't just a ship, it was a floating tomb. Stradling dismissed the navigator's concerns as cowardice, a fatal blunder that prioritized pride over the basic physics of buoyancy. Visual. Macro shot of a shipworm burrowing into a piece of damp, crumbling oak planking. As they rounded the horn, the temperature plummeted to 40 degrees, and the viscous flow of the Southern Ocean began to test every seam. This was the crossing of the threshold, the moment where civilization ends and the dark side of exploration begins. The crew was energized by the adrenaline of the hunt, unaware that their primary vessel was already half-eaten. They were crossing into the Pacific, a place of vast abyssal silence. Selkirk checked his instruments, his hands shaking not from the cold, but from the certainty of the math. Visual. A navigation chart being stained by a single dark drop of seawater. There is a specific kind of madness that takes hold when the gold is just over the horizon. The crew ignored the dampness in the bread and the dark stains of salt rot creeping up the bulkheads. They trusted the wood, but the wood was failing them, bit by bit, grain by grain. Selkirk alone understood the vulnerability of their position. He was a man trapped between a captain he despised and an ocean that was waiting to swallow them whole. The trap was set and the door was closing. Visual. A heavy iron anchor dropping into the black, impenetrable depths of the Pacific. The Pacific is a vast blue indifference that specializes in breaking men who think they've mastered it. By September 1704, the Cinque Ports wasn't a ship anymore. It was a countdown. The air around the Juan Fernandez archipelago was thick, salted with the scent of pimento trees and the roar of breeding sea lions. But inside the hull, the atmosphere was different. It smelled of stagnant bilge and the slow deteriorating scent of wet oak. The initial adrenaline of the hunt had been replaced by a growing jagged unease. Visual. A rusted barometer needle trembling violently against a cracked glass face. The first real red flags didn't come from the sky, but from the pumps. They were running around the clock now, a rhythmic metallic heartbeat that told a story of structural failure. Selkirk watched the water levels in the hold with a forensic focus. The ship was literally dissolving in the tropical brine. Stradling, however, was busy nursing his ego, ignoring the technical debt that was about to come due. He treated the ship's groans as a personal insult rather than a warning. It was a critical blunder of leadership. Visual. Dark stains of seawater seeping through the gaps of a sagging wooden bulkhead. Conflict is a sickness that spreads faster than scurvy in a cramped galley. Selkirk and Stradling weren't just arguing. They were waging a war of ideologies. The navigator saw the forensic truth of the wood. The captain saw only mutiny and a challenge to his vanity. The crew was caught in the middle, their faces etched with the hollow hunger of men who knew they were sailing on a prayer. The tension was a vicious flow of whispers and sharp glances. No one was looking at the horizon anymore. They were all looking at the floorboards. Visual. A pair of navigator's dividers lying forgotten on a table covered in damp, salt-crusted maps. Then came the decision that sealed the archive. Selkirk stood on the deck as they anchored at Massa Tierra and made his final, desperate stand. He refused to sail. He called the ship a floating tomb to the captain's face. It was the ultimate search for survival, a gamble against the unknown of the shore versus the certainty of the deep. Stradling didn't argue. He smiled. He offered Selkirk a choice that wasn't a choice at all. It was an invitation to vanish. The silence that followed was the sound of a man being erased. Visual. A single wooden sea chest sitting solitary on a pristine white beach. The boat pulled away, the oars cutting into the glass-like water with a finality that hit like a physical blow. Selkirk waded into the surf, his voice cracking as he shouted for them to return. The realization of his isolation was an immediate, crushing weight. He had his Bible his musket, and a pound of powder. But the most dangerous artifact he carried was the silence. The Cinque Ports sailed on, a ghost ship carrying its own doom into the distance. The point of no return had been crossed in a moment of pure, stubborn pride. Visual. A wide, high-angle shot of a lone figure shrinking into a speck on a massive volcanic shoreline. The silence on Tierra didn't just fall. It crushed. For the first 8 months, Alexander Selkirk lived in a state of psychological collapse, huddled on the shoreline, paralyzed by the horizon. He watched the ocean with the eyes of a man waiting for a ghost. The breeding sea lions on the beach made a noise like 1,000 dying men. A visceral roar that drove him into the interior. He was abandoned in a paradise that felt like a surgical ward, stripped of every human anchor. Visual. A hand-drawn map of the island with jagged, frantic ink strokes. The logistics of his survival were a forensic nightmare of extreme deprivation. Once his pound of gunpowder vanished, the musket became a heavy bronze paperweight. He had to learn to outrun goats on volcanic cliffs, his feet thickening into natural leather. He was a master navigator reduced to a predator, his civilization fading with every torn garment. The hollow hunger was a constant companion, driving him to eat cabbage trees just to keep the machinery of his body from stopping. Visual. A close-up of a jagged volcanic rock stained with a dry, dark, viscous flow. Then came the plague of rats. They didn't just steal his food. They gnawed at his feet while he slept in his pimento wood hut. To survive, Selkirk had to domesticate the island's feral cats, creating a small feline army to guard his sleep. It was a descent into a strange, lonely kingdom. A man talking to animals because the English language was leaking out of his brain. He was the governor, but his subjects were shadows and predators. The isolation was absolute. Visual. A hand-sewn tunic made of stiff, sun-bleached goat skin for 24 hours. A broken figure for 24 hours. A broken figure in the dirt, waiting for a mercy that the island didn't possess. He woke up under the remains of the animal that had broken his fall. It was the irony of the wild. The prey had become his only cushion against the hard, volcanic truth of his solitude. Visual. A rusted 18th-century knife blade with a notched and pitted edge. 2 ships eventually appeared on the horizon, but they brought no comfort, only the threat of a crimson end. They were Spanish vessels, and for a privateer like Selkirk, rescue meant a slow deterioration in a salt mine. He hid in the high canopy of a pimento tree, watching from the leaves as the sailors searched the beach below. He stayed perfectly still, breathing in the scent of wood and fear, choosing the silence over the shackles. The law of man had officially ended. Visual. A view from a high tree branch looking down at a deserted, sun-drenched beach. The snow of time usually covers the blunders, but the Pacific has a way of washing the truth back to shore. February 2nd, 1709. Captain Woodes Rogers saw a flicker of light on an island that should have been a void. What he found wasn't a man. It was a relic. Alexander Selkirk stood there, clad in the skins of goats he had run to ground with nothing but a rusted blade and a desperate will. He had forgotten the cadence of English. His speech a guttural, faded rasp of a life nearly vanished. Visual. A tattered, sun-bleached British ensign flapping weakly against a backdrop of dark volcanic rock. The forensic irony of the Cinque Ports is a lesson in technical debt. Shortly after abandoning Selkirk, the ship reached the coast of Colombia before the hull finally surrendered to the worms. It didn't just sink, it disintegrated. The crew who chose the ship over the shore found themselves in a viscous flow of misfortune, facing the dark stains of a Spanish dungeon. Stradling's arrogance had led them into a trap of their own making. Selkirk's punishment had actually been his salvation. Visual. A colonial-era prison cell door with heavy rusted iron bars and a small barred window. When Selkirk returned to London, he was a celebrity, a curiosity for the coffee houses to poke and prod. But the archive shows a man who could never quite recalibrate to the noise of civilization. He had lived in a state of absolute forensic purity, where the only metrics that mattered were the wind and the hollow hunger. He built a cave in his garden in Scotland, a silent replica of his island hut, searching for the peace he had lost. The world called it a triumph. Selkirk knew it was a permanent alteration. Visual. An old leather-bound Bible with salt-damaged pages and handwritten marginalia. The legacy of this disaster isn't just a story of survival. It's a warning about the weight of human pride. We look at the journals and see the dates, but we miss the psychological cost of the silence. Selkirk died a decade later, still a navigator, still looking for a horizon that wasn't cluttered by the failures of men. The snow of history might cover the remains, but the forensic truth remains. Isolation is a mirror that shows you exactly what you are when the world stops watching. Visual. A weathered stone grave marker in a lonely, fog-drenched Scottish churchyard. The ledger is closed, but the questions linger in the salt air. Was Selkirk the hero, or just the only man cynical enough to see the end coming? We found his chest, his Bible, and the remains of his camp, but the 4 years of his mind are a total data gap. He left the maps behind and walked into the white, and in the end, he was the only one who truly returned. The expedition failed, but the man survived, a living artifact of the dark side of exploration. Visual. A slow zoom out from a single rusted brass buckle lying in the dark island dirt.